Thank you all for coming. My name is Kevin Blowe. I'm the campaigns coordinator for Netpol and the author of This is Repression, our new report. There are many reasons why this report has the title that it does. Protest policing has unquestionably been arbitrary, oppressive, and violent for decades, of course, and certainly since Netpol was set up in 2009. But I believe that in the last year, based on the information we've gathered together, there has been a sea change, a transformation in the police and state's attitude towards the right to protest. It feels more systematic, basically. What we describe in the report um, as a package of state-sponsored measures designed to impose social control on protests. Now, the report itself addresses some of the factors that, when put together, meant that in 2024, the idea that we're facing state repression, at least in England and Wales, has now become, we say, a meaningful one. So, what are those factors? Well, arguably, one is that the new anti protest laws that were passed in 2022 and 2023 finally, in most cases, only came into effect last year. Secondly, that the police were now fully prepared to fully embrace, with ministerial support, the idea that practically any disruption caused by protests was serious disruption and that required cracking down on. Thirdly, the police had finally managed to expand their surveillance on protest groups after they were criticised in 2021 for the perceived weaknesses of their intelligence gathering in the aftermath of the undercover spy cops inquiry and the scandal associated with that. And fourthly, perhaps too, because last year was a general election year, one that was explicitly fought around a culture war that involved protesters, one where government ministers and corporate lobbyists, people like the ludicrously partisan Lord Walney, whose antics we explore in the report, um, had increasingly and fanatically demonized and smeared protest groups. And the report covers all of these issues, but there are three main themes from last year that dominate the slide into state repression. Obviously, there's more detail in the report itself, but I want to briefly address each one of those in turn. The first and most obvious is Palestine, the dominant issue of 2024. What our report highlights is the repeated restrictions on demonstrations, often with organisers bending over backwards to try and find solutions when faced with last minute obstacles from the police. It highlights the appalling association of all pro-Palestine protests with hate crime and extremism, and especially at a local level, the deeply Islamophobic portrayal of British Muslim communities who wanted to lobby their elected representatives and were portrayed as threats to the safety of councillors and MPs. It highlights the increasing willingness to treat challenges to corporate complicity in Israeli genocide through the use of with the use of organised crime and counter-terrorism powers, which is a subject which I think Huda is going to try and talk about a bit next. And it talks about our report talks about the increasing willingness too for universities to respond to campus protests and accusations of academic complicity in Israeli war crimes by sharing information on their own students with the police. Now, this is state repression. The second big issue for 2024 was the ongoing resistance to state and corporate indifference to the climate crisis. Our report highlights the resources that the police were prepared to throw at shutting down protests before they even took place, with an increasing use of conspiracy charges linked to some of the new anti-protest powers. And Phil will talk more later about the extraordinary policing operation targeting Reclaim the Power last year. The report also highlights the increasing use of harsh prison sentences for climate activism, how campaigners awaiting trial or released into the community after sentencing have faced um, a dysfunctional system of electronic tagging and bail conditions that have made everyday life almost impossible. And again, we have a speaker to talk about this. Nancy will address some of those issues later on. In the report, we've also talked about how judges are no longer willing to accept that conscientious motivations for deciding to break the law are important and are instead following what the report quotes academics as calling a legal flowchart that basically brings people into court and inevitably leads to a conviction. Now, this too is state repression. And the third issue is one that I think has been largely forgotten about, which is last August's race riots. Forgotten despite the fact that it was unquestionably the most significant public order policing crisis for more than a decade, certainly since the English riots of 2011. What we've highlighted is how, despite increasing levels of police surveillance, the police repeatedly ignored the risk to the public from far-right groups. They continually downplayed the risk of racist street violence, even in the months before the riots took place, just as they did, has to be said, around Remembrance Sunday at the Cenotaph in 2023. And what they did instead, both before and when those riots were taking place, was express far more interest in targeting pro-Palestinian, pro-migrant and anti-racist campaigners, just as they were, incidentally, back in 2020, something that we explored in our report on the Black Lives Matter protests of that year. Now, if you remember, the response from the new Starmer government was to pledge to fund more police surveillance and more riot police. However, based on everything we know about the experience of both of those, we fully expect that the resources that have been allocated will disproportionately target the left, anti-capitalist, anti-racist groups, or groups that are involved in supporting international solidarity and justice, just as they always have, and as they always have, falsely in the name of countering terrorism, extremism, and hatred. This too is state repression. And having said all that, I want to acknowledge the dangers of talking about state repression, that it risks playing into the hands of the state by frightening people away from participating in protests and expressing their opinions. That's something that within Netpol we're always very conscious about. But protests are not illegal. Neither are they banned, but they are, as we saw throughout last year, becoming increasingly uncertain and feeling increasingly risky. Nevertheless, I mean, it's important, we think, that and this report attempts to highlight those issues, to name the alarming situation for what it is. This is repression. And that means for movements, it involves getting better organized to resist the measures that are intended to deter and disrupt them. And Netpol has resources that are available to help with that. For NGOs and for policy campaigners, it means demanding the right to know and understand in advance how the police will respond to protests, which has been abandoned entirely by the state over the last 3 or 4 years. But it's been something that Netpol has tried to promote since 2021 with our Charter for Freedom of Assembly Rights. We need to pick that work up again. It means publicly rejecting the idea that protesters are a threat to democracy rather than an absolutely vital part of public participation. It means pushing back against the drift towards state repression before it grows any worse. I say that because, believe me, the one reason why the new serious disruption prevention orders that were in the Public Order Act in 2023, these banning orders targeting key organisers. The only reason why they've not been in place yet is because the state simply hasn't had time to implement them. They're coming, and they too are state repression. Now, I'll leave it there because we've got some really interesting speakers. You can find out more in the full report that's now available online. It will be emailed to everybody that's joined us today. But let me hand over to Huda, who is Huda Ammori, who's a co-founder of the direct action group Palestine Action, and joined us last year when we launched In Our Millions, our report on Palestine solidarity protests, which is also available from our website. Huda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to start by just quickly explaining what Palestine Action is. We are a direct action group that has been taking direct action, especially against the Israeli weapons industry, since 2020. And throughout that time, we've seen peaks and waves in police repression, but it has significantly increased in the past year, along with the intensity of our actions against these Israeli weapons factories. And out of the hundreds of actions, one particular case is the Filton 18. And this started when 6 people drove a modified prison van through 2 security fences and managed to break inside to one of the most highly secured Elbit facilities, which they call a research and development hub. And whilst inside, they managed to destroy Israeli quadcopter drones, the same model of drones we've heard being used to snipe down Palestinian children. After the bombs have dropped, these drones will come down and basically kill those who are left alive or permanently disable them. And after their action, they were all arrested under normal charges and then later rearrested under the Terrorism Act. Over the space of a few months, they've managed to round up 18 people who they're accusing of being connected to the action, making them the Filton 18. Because they were arrested under the Terrorism Act, it meant that the state could hold them for much longer than the usual time limits that you can be held without charge. Some were held for up to a week without any charges in solitary confinement, repeatedly interrogated and deployed, psychological tactics against these people whilst they were detained. And afterwards, they were all charged with ordinary offences and remanded to prison. During some of these arrests, the raids were particularly notable. There would be up to 30 police officers banging down people's doors at 10 different sites across the country. So hundreds of police officers on this job in one day, and smashing people's personal property, dragging people out very early in the morning, harassing family members. In one case, they cuffed someone's 17-year-old younger brother while they conducted the raid and threw them out of their own homes. Because of this terrorism connection, they're not charged under, they're charged under ordinary offences, but they're alleging there's a terrorism connection, which means that they're deemed high security prisoners and are often denied rights that other prisoners may be afforded because of this involvement of the counter-terrorism police in this investigation. And this has even led to UN special rapporteurs intervening and condemning the use of terrorism and their conditions inside prison. Because of this association with terrorism, they've not been granted bail. Some of them may face 2 years in prison on remand, if not given bail before they even have a trial, which is just absolutely insane that you can be held. Some of them have no previous offences, no convictions, unconvicted inside until you have your chance to actually have your day in court. And it's clear that the state have tried to use this case to try and deter Palestine Action. They've seen that imprisoning people before hasn't worked. And, I think terrorism legislation is nearly as far as you can go in terms of trying to stop the momentum that Palestine Action has against the Israeli weapons trade. But if anything, they've served as an inspiration to more people. And often we see repression breeds more resistance. And we've definitely seen that in Palestine Action. But it's no small feat what they're facing. And if it's allowed to stand, this terrorism connection, which will not be decided by a jury. It gets decided by a judge because of the way the state's engineered it. It could then be used against, it has the potential to be used against others in different movements or in the same movement because of how broad the current terrorism legislation is. We are hopeful that they will defeat it. We know it's ludicrous, but we need as much support for the Filton 18 as possible to make sure that this doesn't set a precedent and is not successfully used as a test case for this new level of repression against people. Some other examples, apart from the Filton 18, is Palestine Action's other co-founder, Richard Barnard, was charged for giving a speech at a protest, and they said that he was encouraging support, inviting support recklessly, without even knowing he was, for a prescribed organisation, namely Hamas. And he's been told that the sentencing guidelines for his offence is 2 to 4 years for a speech. So, you know, we are in a current state where, and he's not the only case where this is happening, many Palestinians, non-Palestinians are being arrested under the terrorism legislation, and we're seeing the High Court try and rule out the ability to rely on your human rights to freedom of expression in these cases. And they are clearly trying to section off certain protesters and use them as test cases, and the whole movement needs to rally around these people. We've also seen numerous raids, very intense raids, in addition to the Filton 18, but also cases where people are told they have to live and sleep at an address, which is relatively standard, but that the police would come and check on them. I think in one case, 40 times in a month, I believe, they checked that they were there, which is clearly just harassment. And this is the kind of tactics we're seeing the police use against people who are acting to intervene in a genocide. And rather than sanction a foreign genocidal entity, they are punishing their own citizens, using the process as a punishment against their own citizens. And this is what we have to fight against. We have to stand in solidarity with them, but whilst also continuing the strength of our movement, because ultimately they repress when they are scared and when we are ultimately winning.
Thanks, Huda. That's sobering, but also, you know, there's a lot there that we'll come back to in a bit. I want to pass on to Phil Ball, who is a campaigner with Reclaim the Power, and who's going to tell us a bit about Operation Infusion, the massive policing operation against the planned protest at Drax power station last summer. Over to you, Phil.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Yeah, the reason why I'm here is because of what happened on the 8th of August last year. 26 people were arrested in a pre-dawn raid at about 3:45 a.m. in Yorkshire. I think it was about 7 vehicles were seized. Several tons of equipment was impounded. And this was all equipment that was going to be used to set up a climate camp. Marquees, gazebos, tents, kitchen, like catering equipment, you know, even the kitchen sink, you know, all kinds of stuff. They arrested us for on suspicion of conspiracy to interfere with key infrastructure, Section 7 of the Public Order Act, one of the new laws that the Tories awarded themselves, and as well as that, suspicion of going equipped to lock on, which is Section 1 of the Public Order Act. I was there with Reclaim the Power. That's who we're going to set up the camp. There's the camp program, but we never got to use, because they, you know, the reason why they were arresting us and screwing up the logistics for the camp was to stop it happening. That was clearly their intention. We were there to draw attention to the Drax power station. And I don't, to be honest, I was on the periphery of the group. I was really solely there as a driver, because I've got a license that allows me to drive a 7.5-ton truck. So that's what I was doing. So I mean, I can tell you a tiny bit about what the camp was for. The campaign is about the Drax power station. As you'll be aware, the UK has now got off its dirty coal habit, something I've been campaigning on for 20 years. But yeah, with the last coal power station closing last September, there is one still open, and they sneakily switched from coal to burning wood chip, wood pellets, and waste wood, what they call woody biomass. It's actually more polluting than coal, but because it's classed as carbon neutral, it falls outside the climate targets. Now, Drax, because they call it carbon neutral, Drax receives renewable energy subsidies, 2 million quid a day, and that's been going on for years. And the government has just agreed to sign off to guarantee the profits for Drax for a number of years. I can't remember how much. So they kind of operate in a shadowy loophole of saying that they're green and kind of not being. So yeah, they said we're going to equip to lock on. We know that those laws that were brought in, those new anti-protest laws, were at the behest of right-wing think tanks, and that we know that they're funded by big polluters. So it's a case of the big businesses trying to restrict freedom of speech and trying to, stamp out the truth being told about them. I could talk about the evidence that they've got on us, which is like hilariously weak. But I mean, yeah, the case begins. Well, the case begins tomorrow. The plea hearing is tomorrow in Leeds. So after this Zoom call, I'm going to head off up north and go and hang out with the others and go to the courtroom tomorrow. I've got to say that I fully expected. I mean, they dropped the initial charge of going to interfere with key infrastructure on the grounds that there was insufficient evidence. I mean, we were blatantly not going to interfere with key infrastructure. We were going to a grass field. We were going to bang some tent pegs in, set up a camp, and that's where we were going to be for 6 days. We were also very much not going to lock on. It's got a huge logistical operation to set up, and we weren't about to sort of duck out and start supergluing ourselves to things. So, they say that they've seized equipment that shows that we were going equipped to lock on. I mean, literally, they have found in the back of the truck, they found a cable tie and a piece of rope and planning notes. That's what's on my charge sheet. A cable tie. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never known anybody use a cable tie to lock on. It's like, I mean, it's hilarious, really, if it wasn't so unpleasantly repressive and but it's like the common sense doesn't seem to, well, as we all know, we're dealing with the police, it doesn't seem to follow common sense. When they nicked us, it wasn't just a case of being arrested and being in the police station. They awarded themselves an extra 12 hours to keep us detained, so like nearly 36 hours inside. I wore handcuffs for over 7 hours while they were trying to check me in. They searched home addresses, they confiscated phones and laptops. The vehicles were kept beyond the hire period, which incurred considerable costs, more than £100 a day per vehicle. And they kept them for several more days. They unloaded all the equipment, even stuff that was blatantly irrelevant, and made it extremely hard to get it all back. Some of it was kept for months. Some of it was kept outside in the rain and got ruined. Some of this equipment was due to be loaned or hired to people for like village fetes and things afterwards, and they of course didn't have that equipment. So other unrelated groups incurred costs and expenses and huge inconvenience. People, like even the housemates of arrestees, had laptops seized, and some of those still haven't been given back. I just want to say that the police, because of freedom of information requests that we put in, we've recently discovered that the police operation, which took only a week, and it's just this 7-day period that the freedom of information request refers to, and that's Operation Infusion. It cost 3.1 million quid of taxpayers' money to stop a climate camp. That included 1,070 officers from 39 police forces. That's all of the UK's police forces, including the military police, apart from 5. So it's clear that they're throwing huge resources into this. Yeah, it's the truck that I was driving had flat pack plywood compost toilets in it, thousands of toilet rolls, a ton bag of sawdust, and a load of heavy rubber matting for disabled access and solar panels. So, the police thought that they'd got evidence, but I mean, I know it's a terrible pun, but they had nothing to go on.
Very good, and very good place to finish. I think we're all now thinking about extremist compact toilets now. Thanks, Phil. And it really, I obviously know a lot about the circumstances of that, but it really does illustrate one of the things that we're talking about in terms of the concerns we've got about what happened last year and the direction we're going in. I'm going to move to Nancy, who is from the Climate Action Support Pathway. Our report talks about the targeting of the climate movement of punitive bail conditions and experiences of people in prison. And Nancy is able to tell us much more, because this is the work, direct support that our organisation CASP is involved in. Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm just going to screen share so that you can all see my slides, and then Kat or Kevin, if you could let me know if it's working. It goes. Fantastic. Okay, so Kevin's told you that I'm in the legal team at CASP. We support action takers from a number of movements, including Just Stop Oil. And a lot of what I'm going to say comes from our experience of working with Just Stop Oil supporters. And I can see that some of you are here, including people whose stories I'm going to mention. So I just wanted to say hello to those people as well as everyone else, and thank them for everything that we've learned from supporting them all. I was asked to talk about the increasing pressure on climate protesters. It's a huge topic. I'm going to try and pick out a few interesting things and cover them quickly. So I don't want to spend a long time on this. It's just a sort of snapshot of the record-breaking sentences for climate protesters over time. If we look at the sentence for the Whole Truth 5 gantry campaign Zoom call, it got huge press coverage at the time. They appealed their sentences together with 11 other activists, and the Court of Appeal said that the sentences were manifestly excessive and reduced them a bit. So most of the group now have sentences of 3 years, which is the same as Morgan Troland. Roger Hallam still holds the record for the longest sentence for a climate protester at 4 years. It's possible that this is maybe a little bit of a turning point in a good way, because those sentences were criticised as being manifestly excessive, and the court warned against sentence inflation. But we might find out in the next few weeks there are some Just Stop Oil airport and gantry defendants who will be sentenced, and we may find out what direction sentencing is heading in from those outcomes. This slide is meant to show how the pressure on people taking action for the climate is getting worse in multiple directions. So most of it is different parts of the state, but some other things as well, which I've put in blue. I'd say from our perspective, most of these things seem to be getting worse, are being increasingly used. In particular, so the worst pressure is obviously coming from the government, creating new protest offences, increasing sentence ranges for existing offences, so that things that weren't previously imprisonable now are, attacking legal defences by going to the Court of Appeal to try and restrict the defences that defendants can use. The courts are also increasingly willing to put people on remand and use curfew and GPS tags for people who are on bail awaiting trial. We've got at least one person who's subject to a criminal behaviour order. Nobody's subject to the SDPOs yet that Kevin talked about earlier, but that could possibly change in the next few weeks. And we already have people who are subject to extremely broad licence conditions, which are possibly just as isolating and infringing of normal life as an SDPO anyway. So people prevented from speaking to friends, with restricted computer use. One person has been told they won't be able to attend Labour Party meetings, and said the probation service can pick and choose which elements of the political process I can be involved in. This is just a little side-by-side. They're not actions that were identical, but they're similar sort of actions. So in 2016, this is a group under the banner of Plain Stupid who actually got onto the runway, went through the boundary fence, got onto the runway and locked on at Heathrow, causing flights to be cancelled. They were tried for aggravated trespass, which is an offence with a maximum sentence of 3 months. And they got short, few weeks suspended sentences, which for anyone who doesn't know means they didn't go directly to prison. It's a sort of a last warning. And then on the other side, we've got the group arrested outside the Heathrow boundary fence last year, who are the jury's out right now in their trial for conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, with a maximum sentence of 10 years for what might, if they'd gone through the fence, I think it would have been a different action design, but, you know, kind of comparable. So without speculating, clearly scope for a much higher sentence for them if any of them are convicted. At the other end of the activist spectrum, the potential penalties for walking in the road. This isn't meant to be an alarmist slide, because the police still do facilitate marches all the time, which go off without incidents. But in 2019, the maximum sentence that you could get for walking in the road was a fine, and you would get a warning first before that happened. Now, people have gone to prison only for taking part in Just Stop Oil slow marches, not for taking part in marches with any other movements, but people have gone to prison for walking in the road. So here's a picture of Phoebe Plummer on trial for walking in the road. They were in the first group of people to be tried for Section 7 in the Crown Court. Previously, you wouldn't get a jury trial for marching. Even though the offence has got a statutory defence of reasonable excuse written into it, the judge ruled out the defence, which meant that the defendants couldn't make any human rights arguments about, you know, their right to protest to the jury. They were found guilty, and one of them Phoebe got a custodial sentence, and they appealed their conviction unsuccessfully. The Court of Appeal said that the offence of Section 7, interference with key national infrastructure, is inherently proportionate because it only applies on motorways, A and B roads, so you can still protest on other roads. To me, this seems like an example of an argument which might sound reasonable to someone who's never been on a protest, but if you've ever been on a protest, it's clearly totally detached from reality. Like the idea of trying to plan a march in London which doesn't go on an A or B road is quite hilarious to me. The Court of Appeal also pointed out that there's provision under public order legislation where you can get permission for a march. So you can legally march on A and B roads if you go to the police, get permission and comply with their conditions. But I'm sure we can all draw our own conclusions about the effectiveness of protest, which is state sanctioned and only carried out in accordance with police conditions. Okay, Kat suggested that I touch on punitive bail conditions, and the first thing that came to mind was the use of tags. Tag bail conditions are meant to be an alternative to remand, so they should only be used if the person meets the bar for remand, but we see them used in cases that don't seem to meet that threshold. For example, last week, an action taker who poured latex over the Tesla bot dummy, the damage was valued at under £5,000. So the maximum sentence for that is 3 months. So that doesn't really seem to meet the remand threshold, probably, but they still ended up on tag bail conditions. This slide collates some of the experiences that we've heard from people on tag, but I wanted to read you a couple of quotes from people with lived experience in their own words. One person said, "It's a very psychological punishment. Not only is your life seriously restricted, but you are the one who has to police it. You live in fear of a faulty tag box, of a dead battery sending you to prison." Another person said, "I was for 5 months on GPS tag after slow marching, not allowed to be within the M25. I was given it for breaking bail conditions, not to protest on any road in England or Wales. As a result of being on tag, I was no longer able to work in mental health hospitals whilst wearing the tag. I was once arrested outside a court for not getting my tag fitted when I was clearly wearing my tag. I then had a warrant out on my arrest for breaking the tag condition by going to London when I was attending my trial." So they were attending their own trial in London and ended up with a warrant out for their arrest for that. "I found these things very stressful. I felt subjected to really harsh conditions for simple active protest." And finally, looking at the effects of imprisonment, I think it's fair to say that the variety of experience is huge, depending on the person, their campaign. I think climate prisoners are treated differently from people from Palestine Action, for instance, from prison to prison, different wings, and even from day to day. One of the JSO action takers who's been in prison, George Simonson, has a letter published in The Guardian today, and I just want to read you a short quote from it. He said, "You learn about society by seeing how people are treated in its prisons, and it's an absolute mess in ours. The prison system is insanely broken. People here are not treated like human beings. The entire apparatus is executed with maximum emphasis on punishment and a superficial mention of rehabilitation." And I think that was quite honest. I think often when I speak to action takers, people don't like to complain, and they don't like to scare others who may be facing prison for actions that they've already taken. But the system is broken, and sometimes people are hungry or not able to wash properly, and even though people may try and put a positive spin on it, yeah, people are having a really terrible time. And that's everything that I wanted to say.
Thanks, Nancy. That's obviously very sobering. Some of those stories are also in the report. It is a reminder that the public nuisance is now squarely, as we've said, in the report, a protest-related offence, no longer used for, as it was in the past, for prosecuting activities that polluters are accused of, but instead for imprisoning environmentalists. And I really very, very much welcome your contribution today. It's been really important. We've only got a few minutes left. What I'm going to do is just ask panel members to finish on something which is a bit more positive, because we as I said, we talk about state repression, and there is the danger that it just demotivates and demoralizes people, but there's always been the capacity for people to resist. So what I want to ask is whether the panelists, what do you think social movements and protest groups need to do to hold their ground in the face of increasing police targeting? Can I go to you, Huda, first, if that's okay?
Yeah, well, I think a key thing, and something we've seen work quite well with the Filter 18 campaign, is is having that very close connection between the support teams and the family members, as well as the prisoners. And we've seen out of not out of a choice of their own, but we've seen family members turn into campaigners and become a part of the cause, and and that's been incredible to see how the support team have turned a traumatic situation and to supporting these people to the point where they feel confident to speak out about what has happened to them. But I think ultimately, when it comes to resisting the police repression, it's really important to do two things. One is each time, what tactics are they using? What new methods are they using? And how can we improve and adapt our security measures for the next one? I think we are at a point now where, you know, you can't really do things in public. We have very strong vetting procedures in Palestine Action, and you have to implement a strong security culture because the police are just constantly upping the tools that they're going to use. And it is definitely possible to implement things across the movement and to teach people as they go along about these new ways that you can protect yourself. But the second thing is to keep going with the actions. That is ultimately why they do the suppression. It's always to stop you. When Palestine Action started, we were under, you know, we understood that the state would do everything possible to stop us from getting rid of Israel's biggest weapons manufacturer in this country. And it can be difficult, but you have to overcome every obstacle and continue to build and grow the movement. And, you know, for us, a huge inspiration comes from the Palestinian people. You know, it's been decades and decades of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, of home demolitions, but they continue to implement a sense of resistance in the community. And for Palestinians, the prisoners are always at the forefront of the movement. They're the center of the struggle. And, you know, we try and carry out that same ethos of you have to center the prisoners of your struggle. They are at the forefront. They're bearing the brunt of the resistance that you're enacting. So I think for us, even though it's getting heavier and heavier in this country, we can look to Palestine to see how Palestinians are coping with the, you know, ways which are incomparable to what we are facing, and also learn from their spirit of resistance and learn from their support for their prisoners and their endurance and persevere. So I think that's the key things that I think we can learn, not just from Palestine Action, but from people resisting across the world against these types of measures being implemented.
Thanks, Huda. Can I ask Nancy next? We are running a little bit out of time, so if you can give us one thing that you think would be a way of standing your ground.
I'm really grateful to Huda for that, because it's been difficult for me seeing lots of people waiting for Crown Court trials just for going on a march. I would say that people should switch up tactics, be agile, yeah, and build close communities, support each other.
Thanks. And Phil, if you've got anything you can add from your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, throughout history, whatever the protest group, whatever campaign it is, that, you know, the people at the front, whether it's the suffragettes or the gay rights in the UK or you know, civil rights in the US, the people at the front line are the ones that get hurt physically and psychologically. You know, it's maybe inevitable that some people are gonna you know, find it hard. And there's the famous quote that you probably all know already, that Gandhi came out with, that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And we're at the stage where they're fighting us, and you know, there's a lot of pain involved. I think their response to what we are doing, whatever the campaign is, if they respond like that, it's an indication that we're being effective. In a maybe bizarre way, it's a backhanded compliment. You know, if they're prepared to throw 3.1 million quid at a week's camp in the countryside, and 1,070 police officers, we're clearly touching a nerve. So, you know, it's not, you know, it's not fun necessarily all the time being involved in this thing, but you feel like the sacrifices or that pain is actually for a reason, and you know, we're being effective. if we're pointing out the government's corruption or where they're breaking the law or their terrible foreign policy or their collusion with corrupt governments or cozy relationship with their big energy companies, they don't like it and they respond accordingly. And that's because they're scared of the truth.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to just, because we've got to wind up in a moment. There's a couple of things I wanted to add to this, which is Netpol is an organisation that very much focuses on the on practical solutions to these issues. Huda touched on the issue around a security culture. It's something that we have been to talk to groups about how you minimize state interference in your organising, and that's something we would very much like to go and do more of. We also have a resource which has a shared collective knowledge of resisting surveillance in particular, which you can find at the on our website at solidarity.netpol.org. Obviously, it's really important that people have a basic understanding and they have a know your rights briefing, and that in particular now people are fully understand the risks of talking to the police. And I think that obviously we've talked a lot here about groups facing restrictions and oppressive policing on the streets, but when it's happening to one group, it's happening to many. And so we need to get better as movements at condemning that repression affecting other movements, and when asked to, responding to those calls for solidarity, because it's not that the problems that we're facing are just not going to go away, but they are only going to be challenged by us. One of the things I remember in the run up to the general election last year was talking to NGOs about the prospect of what might happen under Labour that might be different. And one of the unfortunate consequences is that everything that the Conservatives did is now continuing unabated under the new government. And so that means all we've got is each other to fight back against this. So I hope you pick up those resources. I certainly encourage everybody to read the report in detail. There's lots more stories of what's happened over 2024. Our plan is to produce another one of these next year, and to update people on the current state of protest. But certainly, if you need something in the interim, that support that's available from Netpol, we are very, very happy to offer that if we can. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event that we organise. Thank you.